In the lush, verdant landscapes of southeastern Nigeria, particularly within Akwa Ibom state, there exists an ancient whisper passed down through generations of the Ibibio people. This whisper tells of a divine being, Abassi, the sky god, who, unlike other deities that celebrated the creation of humanity, harbored deep reservations about mankind's existence on Earth. Among the Ibibio, one of Nigeria's oldest ethnic groups, this narrative isn't merely folklore, it's a foundational truth that speaks to the complexities of divine intention and human destiny. This isn't a tale of a god joyfully sculpting mankind from clay, nor of a creator breathing life into the dust out of love or curiosity. This is a different kind of beginning. It is the story of resistance, of divine hesitation, and the deep fear that giving humans autonomy would unravel the cosmic balance. Abassi did not want us here. He saw in us the seeds of pride, of independence, of war. He feared that if left unchecked, we would not worship, we would not obey, we would challenge. But the sky god was not alone. His wife, Atai, the goddess of mediation, choice, and compassion, saw something different. She saw potential. She saw promise. And she convinced Abassi to let two humans descend to Earth, but only under strict, sacred rules. They were not to feed themselves. They were not to work. They were not to multiply. They were to live under surveillance, like children in a divine garden where freedom was forbidden. What followed was a quiet rebellion, not of swords or fire, but of instinct and desire. The humans broke the rules. They worked, they fed themselves, they loved, and from that defiance came everything: civilization, language, families, struggle, glory, and death. Abassi's nightmare came true, but so did humanity's first breath. This is not just a myth, it is a mirror, a haunting, beautiful reminder that perhaps we were never meant to be free. And yet we are. This is the complete story of Abassi, the god who tried to stop humanity, and what it means that we're here anyway. To understand why Abassi feared humanity, we must first understand who he was and what he represented. Abassi was not just any god among gods. He was the sky itself, the primordial order, the high and distant force that watched over everything from above. To the Ibibio people, Abassi was the supreme deity, the one who held the universe in delicate equilibrium. He was the embodiment of authority, of control, of divine perfection that could not be challenged. Abassi was not an artisan god, sculpting man from clay with loving hands. He was not a warm father figure. He was vast, untouchable, and ruled with a certainty that left no room for error. He saw the world in clear lines, sacred above, chaotic below. In this cosmology, Abassi lived in the heavens, far removed from the disorder of the earthly realm. His role was to maintain the divine hierarchy, to ensure that balance was preserved between the forces of creation and destruction. He was not cruel, but he was unyielding. His fear of humanity wasn't born from hatred. It was born from his understanding of potential. He knew what intelligence could become. He foresaw the consequences of independence, knowledge that would spiral beyond control, desires that would multiply unchecked, and mortality that would breed suffering. In a world governed by eternal beings, the idea of humans, finite, flawed, hungry, felt not like evolution but contamination. But Abassi was not alone in the heavens. His divine consort, Atai, held a very different perspective. She was goddess of mediation and intercession, a more compassionate and curious counterpart to Abassi's rigidity. Where Abassi embodied distance and hierarchy, Atai represented intervention and connection. She saw the potential in humanity not as a threat, but as a mystery worth exploring. It was Atai who urged Abassi to allow humans to exist, to give them a place on earth, even under restriction. Their relationship, as told in Ibibio myth, is not one of dominance and submission, but of tension and polarity, a divine conversation between caution and courage, control and possibility. Abassi's personality reveals itself most clearly in this divine standoff. His resistance was absolute. He believed that by keeping humans in heaven, feeding them himself, and forbidding them from working or mating, he could prevent the rise of civilization. Civilization to Abassi was not progress. It was a ticking time bomb. In his mind, every independent action taken by humanity moved the universe closer to disorder. His answer to that risk was restriction. His solution was surveillance, and when Atai insisted otherwise, he allowed her experiment, and with dread already burning in his heart. This dynamic between Abassi and Atai reflects an eternal duality found in many spiritual systems, the tension between fear and love, structure and freedom, divine law and human will. Abassi was not wrong in his concerns. In myth, his fears come true. But neither was Atai naive. She understood something deeper, that life, by its very nature, must evolve, must strive, must disobey. Their myth is not just about gods. It is about every parent and child, every ruler and rebel, every heart that hesitates at the edge of the unknown. Abassi, then, is not merely a god to be worshipped. He is a force to be understood. He is the sky itself, remote, constant, and full of warning. He is the guardian of a world that never wanted change. And yet, it was his compromise with Atai that set everything in motion. He is both the architect of limitation and the witness to its inevitable failure. His story is not about creation, but about resistance. And in that resistance, we glimpse the divine struggle over what it means to be truly alive. In the beginning, there was no earth for humanity, no land to till, no rivers to cross, no sky to gaze up at in wonder. There was only the divine plane, a perfect realm, ordered and still, where the gods reigned in silence and certainty. In this realm sat Abassi, the sky god, content to let the universe unfold without the presence of mortal beings. For Abassi, the creation of humans was not part of the sacred design. Where other deities in distant mythologies took pride in their creations, shaped people out of clay, or breathed life into dust with joy, Abassi refused. He saw no need. Why create beings that would only grow restless, ask questions, defy commands, and replicate chaos? But within that serene divine order, there was one voice of disruption, his wife, Atai. She saw a different possibility. Atai was not a rebel in the traditional sense. She did not seek to overthrow her husband's authority or mock the structure he built. But she was curious. She believed there was something incomplete about a world without human presence, something essential missing from the cosmic picture. She looked upon the void where Earth existed, and she imagined more. Atai believed that by placing humans there, a new kind of beauty might unfold, not perfect, not eternal, but alive. And so, she began to argue with Abassi. Their divine conversation was not quick. It was not a single plea or demand. It was a long persuasion, an emotional negotiation between two opposites. Abassi, ever the protector of order, feared that humans would forget the gods, that they would multiply and build and fight and corrupt the land. He feared that once given a chance, humans would not worship, they would dominate. But Atai was insistent. She proposed a compromise, that humans could be created and placed on Earth, but under conditions so strict they would never have the chance to evolve past obedience. No autonomy, no learning, no expansion, just existence, controlled, contained, and ultimately dependent. Abassi reluctantly agreed, But his consent came with deep hesitation. This was no celebration of life. It was an experiment rooted in fear. 2 humans, 1 man and 1 woman, were created and sent to Earth, but their lives were governed by harsh, divine rules. They were not to work. They were not to eat on their own. They were not to learn. And most importantly, they were not to reproduce. Abassi's logic was clear. Without labor, there could be no invention. Without food, there could be no independence. Without children, there could be no future. Earth would become a sterile Eden, quiet, safe, unthreatening. Atai, however, was not naive. She knew that rules made in the heavens often collapse under the weight of lived experience. She had given humans a gift too sacred to contain: life. And life, once it begins, finds a way to grow. Still, she honored her agreement with Abassi and taught the humans the rules. But even as she instructed them, a crack had already formed. The moment the humans stepped onto Earth, something changed. The silence of the sky gave way to the rustle of wind, the warmth of soil, the rhythm of heartbeat. They were no longer under divine hands. They were alone, standing on a world that moved, breathed, and invited questions. This was not the start of civilization. It was the spark, a fragile moment suspended between divine control and human potential. The origin of humanity in Ibibio myth was not a triumph. It was a warning. Earth, in this telling, was never a gift. It was a risk, an allowance made by a cautious god and a hopeful goddess. But the world was watching, and somewhere above, Abassi waited, already certain that it would all go wrong. When Abassi finally yielded to Atai's persuasion and allowed humans to descend to Earth, his agreement was anything but generous. It was laced with suspicion, constraint, and calculation. These new beings were not to be trusted with freedom. If they were to exist at all, they would do so under the strictest divine surveillance, watched, limited, and confined to a life that served more as an experiment than a blessing. The conditions of their existence were laid out with chilling precision, and Atai was tasked with delivering the rules. No food without permission, no work to sustain themselves, and no sex to ensure reproduction. In effect, they were to live but never truly act. The humans would breathe, but they would not grow. Each restriction held deep symbolic weight. The first law, that they mustn't feed themselves, was a prohibition against independence. Abassi feared that if humans learned to feed themselves, they would learn to feed others. With food comes stability, and with stability comes thought. To eat without divine provision would mean stepping outside divine dependency. It would mean the beginning of autonomy, and autonomy was the seed of disobedience. To keep humans hungry unless fed by divine hand was to remind them of their place, subordinates eternally tethered to the will of the gods. The second law, that they must not work, was an even clearer rejection of progress. Labor is creation, and through work humans invent, build, transform. Abassi understood this, and he feared it. He feared that once humans began to work, they would shape the world in their own image rather than in reverence to the gods. Work is the engine of civilization. It leads to cities, to tools, to writing, to systems of law and trade. By banning labor, Abassi wasn't just limiting effort. He was denying the very concept of human development. To work would be to challenge divine order, to act as though the world belonged to them, rather than being a borrowed stage beneath a divine sky. The third and most crucial law, the prohibition of sex, struck at the heart of what it means to be human. Without sex, there would be no reproduction, no children, no future generations. Abassi wanted humans to remain as they were, 2 individuals alone under watch. To reproduce would mean multiplication, and with it, complication. He feared the unpredictable nature of lineage, that children would be born with ambitions, with dreams, with strength and spirit that could not be monitored. To Abassi, the womb was dangerous, the future too wild to permit. So he forbade sex entirely. Humanity was not meant to grow, only to exist, motionless, stagnant, and safe. But beneath these laws lay a deeper philosophy. Abassi's rules were not merely commands. They were a worldview, a belief that safety lies in limitation, that peace comes from control, and that chaos is born from choice. He imagined a world without hunger, without toil, without love or lust or lineage. Not as a punishment, but as perfection. Yet perfection, in the divine sense, often comes at the cost of humanity. These laws, while crafted to protect the universe from human ambition, also denied the essence of human potential. In stripping away food, work, and sex, Abassi was trying to halt the very forces that make life meaningful: nourishment, creativity, and connection. For a time, the first man and woman obeyed. They lived in silence, awaiting divine instruction, dependent on the hand that fed them. But the earth around them pulsed with possibility. The rivers whispered, the soil beckoned. The stars above were distant, and the gods watching were silent. In this fragile balance between divine law and human nature, something ancient stirred, the beginning of a choice. Because rules once spoken must be tested, and silence once broken never returns. The silence didn't last. The rules once imposed slowly unraveled. It began not with a dramatic rebellion, but with a whisper, a quiet hunger, a look between two people, a question left unasked but deeply felt. Though the humans had been told not to eat without permission, not to work, not to touch each other with desire, they were surrounded by a world that seemed to contradict everything they were taught. The earth was full of fruit, soil that invited planting, and rhythms that echoed through their blood. To simply exist as they were instructed felt unnatural. Something deep within them, some divine spark or primal instinct, pushed back against the passive stillness, and so, slowly, tentatively, they began to disobey. The first act of disobedience was to eat. Perhaps it was desperation, perhaps it was curiosity, but one of them reached out and tasted what had not been offered. It was a small act, just a bite, a moment of independence. Yet it shattered the divine order. For the first time, a human had consumed without permission, and in doing so, claimed a piece of life that was meant to be restricted. Next came work. One began to till the soil, to move with purpose, to shape the land rather than merely exist upon it. Tools were made. Effort became habit, and with effort came satisfaction, a sense of meaning that the divine diet had never provided. But the most irreversible step came when they turned to each other. Not in conversation, but in longing. Desire bloomed where it had been forbidden, and with that desire came closeness, and with closeness, the first joining. The humans, once separate, created something new: intimacy, pleasure, creation. From their union came pregnancy, the one thing Abassi had feared above all else. The birth of a child meant the beginning of lineage, of blood passed forward, of lives that could no longer be controlled. In that single moment, the divine experiment collapsed. Humans were no longer a pair. They were a species. When Abassi learned what had happened, his response was not rage, but sorrow. He had not created humanity out of love. He had allowed it as a concession, a compromise forced by Atai's hope. Now that hope had proven him right. The humans had chosen independence, and in doing so, had broken every law. To Abassi, this was not just rebellion. It was the loss of divine control. The humans had begun to act like gods themselves, feeding themselves, shaping their world, creating life. What he had feared had now become reality, a self-perpetuating race that would multiply beyond containment, grow bold, forget their place, and perhaps, one day, challenge the very sky. This fall from innocence was not a fall in the traditional sense. No great battle, no celestial exile. It was quieter, more human. It was the slow, irreversible drift from obedience to freedom. And once crossed, that line could never be redrawn. Abassi could not take back their knowledge, their fire, their hunger for more. He could only retreat, heart heavy, watching as the world he had tried to prevent unfolded before him. Where he had once held the heavens in stillness, now the earth pulsed with movement, unpredictable, imperfect, and alive. In this moment, Abassi ceased to be a participant in the story. He became a distant god, a watcher rather than a ruler. His attempt to keep humanity small had failed, and the consequence was a world he could no longer fully control. His divine vision of stillness, dependence, and silence was broken. What had risen in its place was something messier, more chaotic, and infinitely more dangerous: free will. In disobedience, humanity had found itself. But in doing so, it had also severed its closeness to the divine. The cost of freedom, as always, came not in the moment of rebellion, but in its aftermath. Once the first humans had eaten, worked, and joined together in love, once they had created life of their own, the world shifted irreversibly. What had begun as a divine experiment under strict conditions had now become a force of its own. And Abassi, the sky god who had warned of this very danger, responded not with destruction, but with the final consequence of divine sorrow, the invention of death. For Abassi, the ultimate punishment was not to strike humanity down in fury, but to mark their lives with limitation. In creating their own future, their children, their culture, their choices, humans had severed themselves from the divine eternity they once knew. So Abassi cursed them not with fire or flood, but with mortality. From that moment on, every human would die. No matter how powerful, no matter how wise, no matter how beloved, each would one day return to the dust. Death became the boundary line between the gods and the mortals, the price paid for daring to live without permission. This was not a punishment born of pettiness, but of philosophy. In the Ibibio myth, death is not framed as a random tragedy or a flaw in creation. It is a consequence woven into the fabric of life itself as a reminder. Humanity had chosen to eat, to work, to love, to grow, and in doing so had chosen risk, pain, and ultimately mortality. The beauty of life now came with a shadow. Every joy would carry the weight of impermanence. Every child would inherit not only breath, but a final breath. In this way, Abassi ensured that humans would never forget their origins, nor escape the consequences of their disobedience. Atai, who had once championed the creation of humanity, now watched in silence. Her heart, once filled with hope, was now weighed down by grief. She had believed in humanity's potential, in their ability to live gently, to honor the divine while enjoying Earth's gifts. But even she had underestimated the depth of human desire. She had opened the door, and now she stood beside it, watching as sorrow seeped in. Atai did not turn away from her creation, but neither could she undo what had been set in motion. She too had become a god transformed, no longer just an advocate, but a witness to consequence. As humans multiplied and spread across the earth, so did their complexities. Conflict emerged where harmony was meant to dwell. Jealousy, ambition, and fear crept into the hearts of men and women. What began as a quiet rebellion became a chorus of chaos. Division unfolded between tribes, between lovers, between generations. Each new generation inherited not only life, but the struggle to understand it. And death, once unimagined, became the silent companion of all things. Not cruel, but constant. Abassi withdrew further. He became less present, less involved, no longer feeding or watching or correcting. The divine had done what it could. Now humanity would walk its own path, stumbling, rising, falling again. The world had opened, and with it came the wild, beautiful storm of civilization. Art, war, poetry, betrayal, discovery, all of it would come, and none of it could be stopped. But through it all, the curse of death lingered. A divine scar, a boundary line between what was and what could never be again. In this myth, the Ibibio offer not just an origin story, but a profound meditation on choice. Humanity was never cast out. It walked away step by step from the order of heaven, and the gods, in their sorrow, allowed it. In the gift of freedom came the burden of consequence, and in that tension between divine silence and human sound, the world as we know it began. Though Abassi withdrew from the daily affairs of humanity, his shadow never vanished. Among the Ibibio people, his name still resonates, not as a god of vengeance nor as a myth buried in forgotten clay, but as a presence, a silent sky above, a warning that still breathes. He is remembered not in daily prayers or grand temples, but in the stories told by elders, in the caution passed between generations. He is the God who once said no, the God who hesitated, the God who watched the world begin and then stepped back when it moved beyond him. And in that withdrawal lies his power. Abassi's legacy is not one of fire and thunder. It is quieter, deeper, more enduring. In Ibibio cosmology, the world is not divided between good and evil in black and white terms. Instead, it is understood as a delicate balance between forces, divine and human, order and freedom, blessing and consequence. Abassi is the guardian of that balance, the original point of cosmic stillness from which all motion came. He is not worshipped like a benevolent father, nor feared like a wrathful deity. He is acknowledged as one acknowledges a mountain, a river, or the night sky. He is there, he watches, and in his watching, he reminds. The myth of Abassi is, in many ways, not about punishment, but about awareness. It is a lesson in choice, in limitation, in the weight of becoming. It teaches that freedom is not free, that to step beyond protection is to step into responsibility. The story holds up a mirror. It asks why we hunger, why we labor, why we love, and why we die. And it answers not with scorn, but with history. These things, it says, were not accidents. They were chosen, not by the gods, by us. Abassi's greatest act was not creating humanity. It was allowing it to continue. And that permission, though reluctant, was the doorway to everything we now call life. In modern Ibibio culture, this story continues to echo. Though the cosmology has blended with Christianity and other belief systems over time, the underlying narrative of divine distance and human responsibility remains. The elders still speak of the sky god who gave humanity a chance, and what humanity did with it. His name is invoked in quiet awe, sometimes in moments of grief, sometimes in reflection. Children are told the tale not just to explain death, but to understand life, its boundaries, its blessings, its burdens. To this day, in rural communities, the stars are sometimes seen as the eyes of Abassi, watching without interference, present without proximity. Abassi's role in the myth also serves as a profound critique of power, divine or human. He is the archetype of the ruler who fears what he cannot control, of the god who sees the future not as potential but as risk. His story invites us to ask, what happens when power clings too tightly? What happens when fear of change overrides faith in growth? Atai, in contrast, believed in possibility. She opened the door, but Abassi's response teaches us that even the highest power cannot stop life from unfolding once it begins. Control may delay change, but it cannot prevent it. His retreat, his curse, his silence, all become symbols of a world that must move forward even without divine permission. And yet he still watches. He is still there, above the clouds, behind the stars, in the spaces between certainty and doubt, not guiding, not intervening, simply witnessing. The Ibibio do not forget this. Their myths do not offer easy comforts. Instead, they offer truth wrapped in story, that we were never meant to be here, but here we are, that we were warned, but we chose anyway, and that in the quiet distance of the heavens, a god named Abassi still sees us, not with anger, but with the eternal eyes of one who once said no and then let us go. Maybe we weren't meant to stay. Maybe this world, vibrant, unpredictable, filled with both pain and beauty, was never part of the original design. Maybe we were just a moment of divine curiosity, a reluctant experiment whispered into existence by a goddess who believed in what could be. And maybe, just maybe, the sky god was right to be afraid. Because once humanity tasted independence, once we knew hunger and desire and the thrill of building something with our own hands, we could never go back. We could never again be still. The story of Abassi isn't one of cruelty. It is a story of tension, between fear and hope, between order and freedom, between gods who want control and humans who crave meaning. It is a myth that doesn't offer a paradise lost, but a paradise refused, not out of punishment, but out of principle. And in that refusal, we were made free. But freedom came with a price. We inherited death, we inherited struggle, and yet in those things, we also found love, art, family, and civilization. We found ourselves. Abassi still watches, they say, not because he waits to strike us down, but because he remains part of the story, a silent witness to everything he once feared. And in some way, his presence reminds us of the line we crossed, the moment when we chose to become more than what we were allowed to be. It's easy to see him as a distant, withdrawn god, but perhaps his silence is not judgment. Perhaps it is awe. Humanity has done the unthinkable. We have built, destroyed, learned, forgotten, and remembered. We have lived in the space between the divine and the mortal, never quite belonging to either. The myth of Abassi is more than a tale from the Ibibio people. It is a mirror held up to our own world. It asks why we are here and whether being here was ever truly part of the plan. But it also says that even in defiance, there is destiny, that maybe what we were never meant to be has become what we were always meant to become. If the echoes of this myth stirred the dust in your bones, let this not be the end. Mark your presence with a like. Inscribe your name among our tribe by subscribing, and pass the flame to one who still listens when the gods whisper.